Hey everyone, Andrew here. This video is going to be a little longer than my previous ones because we'll be building a Laravel application starting completely from scratch and going into a usable product. What we're going to be left with might not be super rich in features, but it will be a completely functional app. So, what are we building? Well, we're going to try and mimic a service called Linktree. If you're unfamiliar with the name, it's a service that lets you add a variety of links to websites, social network profiles, or anything else, and consolidates them into a page under a single URL. This way, on sites like Instagram or Twitter where you're only allowed one URL, your followers can click this and see more than just one website. You can also use it to track visitors to each of your links and even customize your page to match your specific style. So this is what we're going to try to build in Laravel. Both the dashboard side where someone can add in their links, and a front-facing side where a visitor can click on those links from a single page. So right now we have a blank Laravel project right out of the box. For starters, I like to think about my app in terms of data and what we'll be storing. Using Lucidchart, I created this database diagram showing the 3 tables that we'll be using in our app, as well as the columns associated with each of them. We have a users table, a links table, and a visits table. Each user has multiple links, and each link has multiple visits. Let's open up our code base and get started implementing this. We are already provided a user model by default, so we'll just create our other 2 models that we'll need using Artisan. PHP artisan make model link, and passing in the migration flag so that we can skip a step and create the migration at the same time. And let's do the same for the visit model. Now that we have our models and migrations created, it's time to get our columns added in that were specified in the diagram. Let's open up all 3 of our migrations, and we're going to start with the users table. We don't need a name, instead we'll use this same column for username. I'll also move that after the email column and get rid of the email verification. Okay, looks like we'll also need a string to serve as the background color. And we'll also give this a default value of white. And lastly, a text color string with a default value of black. Those default values will save us from having to specify the initial background and text colors whenever a user is created. Okay, let's take a look at our links table now. First thing, we need an integer to represent our user_ID column so that we can form that relationship back to a user model. Looking back at our data diagram, we'll need a string to represent the name of our link, and we also need a column for the link itself. We could use a string here, but I'm going to actually use text, just in case someone ends up adding a link that's longer than 255 characters. That's all we need for links, so finally let's create the columns for our visits table. Just like with our previous migration, an integer for link ID that forms the relationship of a visit back to a link. And the only other thing that we're going to be storing in here is the visitor's user agent, which a text column with a default null value will do just fine for. Now that we have our actual database organization laid out, it's time to work on our Laravel models. Let's open up all 3 and get started on user first. Under this fillable property is a list of columns that you can mass fill in with data when creating an instance of this model. We are not using name anymore, so let's change that to username, and also add in the background color and text color properties. We can also get rid of this email verification property since we're not using that for this application. What we do need though is a connection to our links table. Each user will have multiple links associated with them. So to reference that using our model, we create a public function called links that just returns this, has many, and then our link class. I'll show you how these are pulled through our user model later in this video, don't worry. Now let's bring our attention to the link model. Just like with the user, we want to be able to easily mass assign data to a new link whenever it's created. The easiest way to allow any column to be mass assigned is by adding a protected guarded property to this class, and assigning it an empty array. We're telling Laravel, don't guard any column from being mass assigned, instead of specifying the ones that should be. Just like our links relationship on our user model, we'll need to create the inverse here. Public function user, and it returns this, belongs to our user class. Each link belongs to a user. Likewise, each link has many visits. So using the same syntax, we'll add that method below this one. Finally, our visit class. Just like with link, we are not going to be guarding any mass assignment. And all visits belong to a link, so we can add that relationship in here as well. This completes the chain hierarchy of our models, where each user has multiple links, and each link has multiple visits, with each of the relationships working backwards as well. Each visit belongs to a link, and that link belongs to a user. However, what if we wanted to skip the links table and see how many total visits a particular user has in their account? Laravel makes this relationship super easy. If we go back to our user model and create a new method called visits, we can return this has many through. It accepts two arguments, the final class you want to collect, and the intermediary class that the relationship passes through. We want to get all of the visits for all of the links that a user has. Alright, now it looks like we're all done setting up our data layer, and we can start building out these tables in our database. Let's head over to the console and run php artisan migrate to build them. A quick side note, I'm actually going to be using DCR artisan instead of PHP artisan periodically throughout this video. This is because my setup is running through a local Docker installation, and it's an alias shortcut that I've created for using Docker Compose Run. If you'd like to learn more about how I've set that up and use it, I provided a link to the video in the description. Alright, our database has been built successfully. Now it's time to turn our attention to the routes. Let's open up the routes web.php file and clean out this commented area for some room. By default, we have our welcome view being rendered on the landing page of our app, but we also want to be able to render out a list of links each time that a user's profile page is visited. And that should be designated by whatever the URL is, / the user's username. So let's create that with route get, a user placeholder, and it will call userController's show method. That controller isn't created yet, but we'll circle back to it once we have all of our routes scoped out. Keeping this going, we'll also need a route to record visits to our links so the user can see when a visitor has clicked on one, and do something like /visit, link placeholder, calling the visitController's store method. There's a slight problem with this current setup though. Because the user placeholder is directly after a / with nothing after it, it should be the absolute last URL. Laravel reads these route paths from the top down to decide when to render one. So if this /anything route was before another defined route, it would be the one to fire off the render. I like to call these catch-all routes, and it should stay at the bottom of our routes web.php file. Now that we have our visitor-facing routes out of the way, we need our dashboard routes, like when a user sees all of their links, or creates a new one, or edits one. For convenience sake, let's have all of these wrapped under a /dashboard path, and we need all of these only to be accessible to a logged in user. Otherwise, how would we know how to display which links? Both of those can easily be done by creating a route group and passing in an array that specifies the middleware as auth and the prefix as dashboard. The second argument is a closure function that will contain all of the routes inside of this group. Now, if we describe something like route get links, which uses the link controller's index function, that route is actually accessible at our domain /dashboard/links and only available to view by an authenticated user. Let's add in all of our other dashboard routes that we'll need for this app. Just as an aside, we could use something like route resource for the above, which would condense something like this into a single line. However, I'm making some slight deviations from the way that would be used, and also, I just like having all of my routes defined individually like this. That should be everything we need for our dashboard. We're giving our users the ability to create or edit their links, as well as update some profile settings. Skipping back to what I mentioned earlier, these dashboard routes are wrapped in an auth middleware, so we need a way to register and authenticate users coming into our application. While we could roll our own authentication routes, controllers, and methods, we're going to let Laravel handle this for us. Previous versions of the framework used to include boilerplate registration and authentication out of the box, but ever since version 6 was released, it's installed through a separate package and not included by default. No problem though, all we have to do is run composer require Laravel UI in our terminal from the project root. And once that's done, we can look at the documentation to determine what artisan command we'll need to generate the authentication scaffolding. We're going to use some bootstrap styling and aren't using a front-end JavaScript framework, so it looks like UI bootstrap with the auth flag will be the best choice. Let's head back to our project and in the terminal, run php artisan UI bootstrap auth. Alright, that went through successfully, and we can see a bunch of new controllers and views have been added to our project. It looks like all we need to do now is install and compile these assets using npm. So npm install and npm run dev in our terminal. Once that's finished, we can refresh our site and verify that the view in Bootstrap CSS is displaying correctly. Back in our project's routes web file, we need to add in auth routes, which is a helper that will populate all of the paths for the registration, login, and password reset routes. If we head back into our browser now, we can go to the register page and start signing up for an account. But there's a problem here. We are not storing a name for our user. We changed that to username. So we'll need to make some adjustments in our code to reflect that. Let's head back into our project. Opening up the views auth register.blade.php file, we can change all of the instances of name to username. And then in the register controller, update the indexes under the validation and user create calls from name to username. Okay, let's head back to our browser and refresh. Perfect! Name is now username. Let's add in some test data and try signing up. Well, we are presented with an error that user controller doesn't exist, but we've landed on the home path though, which means that our sign up worked. We can actually verify that by going into our apps database and seeing that our user object was created and stored successfully. Well, why the error? Remember our catch-all route at the bottom of our routes web file that goes to the user controller show method? Well, we don't have a home route defined, so it's catching that and trying to route to it, but we haven't created that user controller or show method yet. Now would actually be a good time to get those created. Using the terminal, let's run php artisan make controller user controller. We'll also need a link controller and a visit controller. After those are created, let's go into each one and add in the methods needed from our routes web.php file. Starting off with user controller, we're going to be using the user model, and our routes file specifies an edit method, as well as an update method. Since the update method is a post request, we'll pass through the request object. Next comes the visit controller. This uses the app visit model, and just as a store post request, so we just need the one method. We're also passing in a link to this and using the implicit model binding method to easily retrieve it. So as a second parameter, we'll add link. Finally, the link controller. We have all of these methods defined in our route file, so let's go through and add them all. Alright, all done. Looks like the last route we have to add a method for is user controllers show. For that, we'll just need to pass through the user object as a parameter. And we're just going to return that user to test it out. We have a problem right off the bat though. I want our URLs to look like this. The domain, then / the username. We have a user in the database, but it's returning a 404. That's because by default, when using implicit model binding methods like we are, it expects the ID of the model in the URL. See, if we use /1, we get the user that we're expecting. It's easy to change this though, so let's take care of it. If we head to the bottom of our user model class, all we need to do is add in a method called getRouteKeyName and have it return the name of the column that we want to use. In our case, that's username. Alright, let's save this and go back to our browser. Perfect. It's pulling in our user when using the username in the URL. The next quick fix I want to make is what happens when a user finishes registering or signs in. Laravel is going to automatically redirect them to /home, but we want them to go to /dashboard/links, where they can view all of the links associated with their account. If we go to the login controller, we can see there's a protected redirect to property, and that's calling a constant called home in the route service provider. Opening up that file, we just have to scroll down to that definition and change /home to /dashboard/links. You could even make this like an env call or a config setting if you want it to change depending on the environment. Now, logging in brings us to dashboard links, which is exactly what we want. Unfortunately though, this is blank right now, so let's get to fixing it. In our link controller's index method, we're going to return a view and attach to that view some links. Now we could do something like links equals link where user underscore ID equals auth ID get, but that's a little too convoluted for me. I personally like working from a parent model down whenever possible, and what I mean by that is this. Since each user has multiple links attached to them, we can say links equals auth user links get. It's a cleaner syntax and one that I personally like working with more. Oops, almost forgot to add in the use auth statement at the top. Now, all we have to do is determine the actual view to return. Since we're in the link controller index method, I'm going to use that naming convention and have it as links index. Let's go ahead and create the links directory. And index.blade.php under it. Extending the Layouts app template and the content section, we'll add in some markup for our links page. This is just default Bootstrap classes. We'll have a container holding a single card titled Your Links. And a table containing the name, URL, number of visits, last visited date, and actions of those links. And now we can run a for each loop on the links that we passed in, returning the name, the link. Actually, let's make this an actual link. And for the visits, we'll just come back to that. For now, we'll just hard code in 0. Same with the last visited date. And our action is going to be a link, going to /dashboard/links and the link ID, which will route us to the edit page for this particular link. At the bottom, let's add in a button to send us to the Create Links page. Okay, let's see what that looks like in our browser. There's a row displaying here, and there's something else missing from the top right. Oh, I see what happened. This row didn't autocomplete correctly. Let's fix that. And let's open up the main layout/app.blade.php file and see what's missing from the header. Oh, it's trying to display the user's name, which doesn't exist. Let's switch that to username. Alright, let's see how this looks now. Much better. Although we want to be able to add in some links. Right now, that button sends us to a blank links/new page, so that's what we'll build out next. Navigating back to the link controller and scrolling down to the create method, all we have to do for this is just return a view. We'll call it links create and make that Blade template file under our links folder. For simplicity's sake, we'll also just copy and paste what was in our index.blade file into this and make some adjustments. Changing the page title, removing the whole links table, and adding in a form to create our link. Our method is going to be the link controller store route that we set up, which is the same path that we're currently on, just with a method of post. And let's start scaffolding out this form. We have an input for a name, an input for a link URL, the CSRF field, and a button to submit this form. By the way, this @CSRF line here protects Laravel post requests against common cross-site attacks. It's essentially a shorthand way of writing out a hidden input with the value of Laravel's generated CSRF token helper method. So this is what our create a new link page looks like now. We can add in a name for our link, a URL, and do nothing. We haven't hooked up the functionality of this form yet. Going back into our link controller, the store method that we previously added in is what will handle that. Instinct might be to run with link create and pass in the user underscore ID from the auth facade, then the name and link from request variables, but just like with our index method, I prefer a slightly different approach. Instead, we'll start with our main user object from auth, and then chain on our links relationship. After that, we call create to make a new link that's automatically associated with our authenticated user. Then instead of passing in an array of values, we can use request only with an array of keys that we just want to get passed in from the form. In this case, name and link. The create method expects an array, and request only is returning an array keyed by the form fields we specified, along with their values attached. Then, if the link is created successfully, we'll return back to the main links page. Otherwise, we'll just return back to the previous page. So let's try this out. Perfect! Our link was created successfully and shows up in our links index view. There's a problem that we should address though. What if someone tries adding in a URL that isn't the right format, or leaves one of the fields blank? There's no default in the database, so it would error out when creating the link. This is where Laravel's request validation comes in handy. Before we do anything else in our store method, we can run request validate, which expects an array of keys and values. The keys align with the request attributes, or in this case form fields, being passed in. And the values are rules that we can use to determine if the values of those fields are appropriate for our method. For the name, it's required, and we want to have a max length of 255 characters. For the link, it's also required, and it should be in a valid URL format. There's a long list of these validation rules on Laravel's documentation site, and you can chain multiple together using the pipe character. The attribute won't be valid unless all of the rules for that key pass. The best part is that if this validation fails, the application automatically redirects back to the last request and flashes some error data to the session for display in your front end. Opening back up our create.blade file, let's create spaces to use that error data. Under our link input, we can use if errors first, and then the name of our input, which happens to be name. Then we'll return an invalid input div, echoing out the value of errors first, name. And we'll copy the same to our link input. Because we're using Bootstrap, these errors won't appear though unless we add in a class to our input elements. So in the class field for them, We'll echo out using an inline conditional for the error's first name value and return the isInvalid class or nothing. Copy the same thing to our link input and we should be good to go. Let's check this out in the browser. Okay, so let's leave the name blank and add in a word instead of a URL for our link. Hitting Save Link, the application returns back generic error messages based on what the validation determined was missing from our inputs. You might notice though that each time we submitted, the inputs were wiped out. We can decide to return back the invalid data that the user added in by setting the value of our inputs to old, with the input name passed in as the argument. Old contains the flashback data the user provided whenever the error messages are returned. Using it as the value will keep that input persistent. See, still showing what I added in. Okay, the links create page looks good, so let's use it to create 2 more links for my account. Now, what if I wanted to edit one of these links using our edit action? It's leading to another blank view, so that's what we'll be working on next. In our link controller's edit method, we're just going to return a link edit blade template, passing through the link that we want to edit. But what if I decide to manually change the link ID in the URL to something else? Maybe a link that's not in my account. I shouldn't be able to edit another user's link, so we'll have to add in a check to prevent this from happening. It should be pretty simple. If the user ID of the link I'm trying to edit isn't the authenticated user's ID, then we'll just return a 404 error. One returns fine, and 5 throws the error. Perfect. Now for that edit blade template, well, it's going to be super similar to the one that we used for create. So we can just copy its contents into an edit.blade.php file. All we need to do is change out the title of the page, switch the form action URL to the one used for the link controller update method, and use the pass-through link name and link values for the form's input values. Viewing this in the browser, we have our edit form that's pre-populated with our link info. Saving the changes to a link will also take a decent portion from the store method in our link controller, so let's copy that over. The biggest thing we have to change in this method is the create call here. We're getting a valid link object due to our implicit model binding, so we can just call update directly on that. Then pass through an array containing the name and link values by using the request only call that we use in the create method. And we'll remove this conditional, returning back to the main links index page. Almost forgot one thing. We'll need to make sure the link we're updating belongs to our authenticated user. If it doesn't, we'll return a 403 unauthorized error. Alright, let's open up our browser and see how this looks. We'll just change out something in our link and... perfect. Our link name was updated successfully. Let's just change it back. And that works too. But what about deletion? Surely our users would want to be able to delete a link they might have added by accident. So let's go back to our edit.blade template and add in a button to delete the link. That looks good. Now, if we look back at our routes web file, you can see that the delete route expects a delete header, as opposed to a get or post. This means two things. One is that we'll have to submit a form to delete the link, and that form needs to be sent with the delete method. Unfortunately, forms can only be natively submitted with get or post, but luckily Laravel has an easy workaround. Let's create our simple delete form outside of the edit form. It will use the same method, but after the CSRF directive, we'll attach this method helper, passing in delete as the argument. This is a shortcode that will generate a hidden input helping Laravel overwrite the default form method, instead sending it with a delete header. On our delete button, we want to submit the delete form when it's clicked. We can use some inline native JavaScript to get the job done by hooking into the onClick attribute. Event prevent default will negate any effects of the button click, and then get element by ID, delete form, submit. That's pretty simple, right? This form doesn't do anything yet, so let's head over to the destroy method we set up in the link controller. We'll use the same verification from the update and edit methods, making sure this link belongs to our authenticated user, and redirect back to the link's index page when we're done. Between those, it's just a matter of running link delete to remove it from the database. Time to test it out. Uh-oh, something went wrong. Let's take a look at that form again. Oh wow, okay, I see what I did wrong. I just swapped the action and method. Alright, one more time. Perfect. My link was deleted successfully. Let's just add that back in, and we're good to go. Next up, the actual link page. If I head to my app/my username, I expect to see a list of my links here, so let's make that happen. In our user controller under the show method, right now we're just displaying this home view. Let's replace that with one called users show, and we'll pass in our user that's given to us through the model binding. All that's left to do is actually create the view, users show.blade.php. Just like with our dashboard views, we'll extend the layouts app template, and add in some markup to the content section. A container, row, thin column, and a for each loop of our links. Each one will be wrapped up in a div and contain the link going out to the URL. Add in a few classes, target blank and rel nofollow, and some inline styles for a border that matches the text color value, and the actual color as well. The link will display the name associated with it, and that should wrap it up. You may notice that we're doing for each user links instead of for each links. We could do it that way, and then in the user controller pull in the links by finding the ones associated with the user ID of our authenticated user. But like everything else we've done so far, I like working from a single point down. Our user has many links, and that's how we're going to pull them through. One thing to note though, is that using this method causes a secondary SQL query to happen when rendering the blade template. We can help remedy that though by offsetting that to our controller. If we call the load method on our user object and pass through the name of a relationship, in our case links, it will lazy load those relationships automatically onto our user object before passing it through to the view. Let's head to our browser, and here's our links page. It's looking good and works exactly how Linktree does, opening each link in its own separate tab. Now let's try pulling in the background color by using an inline style for the background. Looking even better. However, I really don't want that large bar at the top of the screen when you're on an individual user's page. I just want it to be links. So let's take care of that. Instead of extending layouts app, let's use the app.blade template and copy it to one called links.blade.php. In this layout, we're going to use an inline style tag to give the whole body the background color that our user object has. And then remove the entire header and any other elements that we don't want. Okay, that's almost perfect. Let's just add a little bit of padding at the top of the list. Awesome, we have a single page of our users' links with the full background color of their choice. Speaking of background color, what if we wanted to change that? Right now, we don't have a settings option or anything in our dashboard, so let's add one to this dropdown. In our app.blade layout, we'll just tack on another drop-down item link here, and it will go to our previously added dashboard settings route, which that uses the user controller's edit method. Just like the edit method for our links, we need to return a view, and then pass through our user, which we can get with the auth helper. Now let's create that view under our users folder, edit.blade.php. Since I'm just going to be adding two input fields, one for the background color and one for the text color, we'll just go ahead and copy over the links edit template into this and make some small adjustments. Remove the delete button, change the button text to save settings, update the form action and page title, and let's go through these inputs and change them to the desired attributes. Alright, back to the browser and looking good. Now we just have to handle this form submission. So, back to our user controller and into the update method, which, just like what we did with the link controller's update method, we can chain update on our authenticated user object and pass through just the request attributes that we want to update. In our case, that's background_color and text_color. After that's done, we'll just redirect right back to the settings page. But I only want my users to add in hexadecimal codes for these values. I don't want text, and I don't want them to leave it blank, otherwise it might affect their links page being rendered. Just like with our links, we can validate the request to make sure the values being passed through are appropriate. Using a combination of Laravel validation rules, this is actually pretty easy to accomplish. Starting with the background color, it's required, it has to be exactly 7 characters long, and it has to start with a pound symbol. Text color is the exact same rule set, since they're both hex color values. Going back to the browser, updating these values with full hexadecimal colors goes through fine. And if we remove some of the characters, or don't include the pound symbol at the front, we get an error message back. And checking out our user's links page, we can see the background and text colors have updated to the values that we set. Actually, that color's a little bright. Let's tone it down a bit. That's slightly better. Something I noticed though is that there's no feedback when the settings are saved successfully, so our users might not know that their colors were updated. We can fix this. Let's head back to our user controller's update method. At the end of this, where we're doing our redirect, we can tack on the with method. This takes in an array of key value pairs and flashes them to the session when the redirect happens. By attaching this simple message to the success key, we'll be able to check and echo out that session variable using the same key on the blade template. Under our save button, we'll add if session success and provide a valid feedback element echoing out that message in the session. Just like our error messages though, we have to include a class on the button in order for this message to show up. So I'll just add in this quick inline conditional here that'll add isValid to the class list if that success message is present. Alright, let's check it out. Back on our browser in our user settings, let's hit Save Settings. And our success message appears. It's flashed over, which means it just exists for this one instance, and refreshing or loading the page again will make it disappear. It looks like the last thing that we have to cover is the visits for our links. Let's first tackle displaying the appropriate data in our dashboard instead of these hard-coded values. In the links index.blade template, we need to get the total count of visits for each of these links. We could do something like echo out link, visits, count, getting the count of the visits relationship, but there's of course an easier way. In our link controller's index method, between the links and get call, we can chain on with counts and pass through the visit relationship name. What this does is create a new attribute in our data, a combination of the relationship name and _count, returning a single integer that's the amount of attached relationships to that specific data object. By using this, we can then update our blade template to just echo out link visits_count. They're all zeros, but that's accurate right now since we have no visits in our database. Alright, what about the latest visit date? Well, we could use some inline PHP in our blade template to pull out the latest visit from the links visits relationship. Then echo out the created@date for it in a format that's more readable to our users. We'll also probably have to make this a conditional in case there's no latest visit, which is true in our current dashboard. But see, I don't really like this approach that much, especially because it contains inline PHP in our blade template, which I like to avoid as much as possible. Where I can, I use my controller or method classes to organize and format the data, and the blade templates are just for displaying it. So let's head back to our link controller, and between our with count and get methods, we're going to chain on another one called with, passing in latest_visit. With works the same way as our load call from the user controller. It lazy loads in a relationship's data to our original data object. In this case, each link will have an attached latest_visit attribute. But what is that? Well, we'll have to define it in our link model. At the bottom of our class, let's add in a new public method called latest_visit. It's going to return a relationship to visits, but instead of a one-to-many relationship like the one above, it's going to return has1 with latest chained on the end. This is a nice little shortcut in Laravel, and lets us get the single newest associated relationship by the created@date. By the way, off screen here I'm going to manually add in a test visit so you can see what it looks like. Now, if we refresh our browser, we can see this attribute pulling in to each of our links. Two have a value of null, while the first is a full visit data object. This is what we'll be using in our blade template now to display the latest visit date. In our links index template, all we have to do is check for that latest_visit attribute not being null, and return the formatted created@date for it. Otherwise, we'll just display in A. Refreshing the browser, and nice! Exactly what we want. But right now, clicking these links doesn't record a visit. We could route these links to a specific get route to do that, and then redirect to the actual URL, but it would defeat the purpose of having visitors be able to save or copy these links on their device. Instead, let's use some simple JavaScript to record them asynchronously. Thanks to the bootstrapped files that the Laravel UI package pulled in earlier, we have a bootstrap.js file and an app.js file that includes some helpful libraries out of the box like jQuery and Axios. Let's open up the app.js file and get started. You may have noticed that I added this user link class on the individual links on the user's show template, and that's what we're going to use to create our click event listener. Using jQuery, when a user link is clicked, we're going to store that link by firing off a request asynchronously. That way, the link click and visit isn't interrupted. Using Axios, we'll post to the visits store route /visit/linkid and pass in a link that's composed of the clicked on links URL. After that finishes, we'll just dump the response in the console log. And if there happens to be an error, we'll add that to the console as well. So what about the values for link ID and link URL? Well, link URL is easy to get. By the way, feel free to use let instead of var, but I'll keep it for this demo. Using jQuery, we can just grab the href attribute of what we clicked on through the this object. The ID is harder because we don't currently have an easy way of getting that with the data we have now. What I've decided to do is just head back to the user's show blade template and add in a data link ID attribute. For the value, just echoing out the ID of the link. Then back on our app.js file, we can just use the this object, data, link ID. Okay, our last piece of this is the functionality to actually store this visit. Let's open up Visit Controller, and the only method here is our store method. Off the bat, we could easily do visit create and pass through the link ID, but we're already getting a link object due to the model binding in the method parameters. So we can just use that link object and chain on the visits relationship, then the create method, which will automatically associate this visit with this link's ID. The only value we need to pass through is the user agent, which we can get with request user agent. Okay, looks good. Time to compile our JavaScript by running npm run dev in the terminal and take a look at our site in the browser. On our user's link page, we have our console open so we can check that the link visits are working. If we click on one, it opens a link in a new tab, and going back to our links list, we can see that the visit was recorded and its data sent back to the console. We can verify that our dashboard data is also displaying correctly by refreshing the links index view and seeing that the GitHub profile links visits have gone up by 1. Let's visit a few more of these. And the data is updating as expected. Both the views and latest view date are displaying correctly. Refreshing the opened pages doesn't record new visits, but clicking the links in the user's link list does. We could probably perform some validation and checks to prevent that from happening, but that's for another video. Alright, that's about it. In this video, we've learned how to create a basic Linktree clone from scratch using Laravel and Laravel's UI package. We've organized a data structure, implemented it with models and migrations, created routes for our application, gated some with authentication, and sent post requests asynchronously with some basic JavaScript. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me in the comments or on my Twitter linked below. Huge thanks to my GitHub sponsors and everyone else who continues to support these videos. Thanks for watching.